There is so much going on during a typical game of chess, and figuring out what the right plan is can be pretty challenging. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I suspect that you've probably run into this issue as well. I have a pretty interesting game to show you today, and basically, when we got down to the endgame, it was quite sharp and quite dynamic in a couple of ways, and I totally missed what the right plan was. I should have been winning, actually, and I totally missed the correct plan. But the key idea is pretty interesting and quite instructional as well. And so I wanted to share that with you today. So let's go ahead and have a look, and hopefully this will be helpful for you if you ever find yourself in kind of a similar situation in the end game. This was round 2 of a tournament that I played recently, and I was playing with the black pieces in this case. And actually, if you missed it, I made a couple videos about this tournament already. My round 1 game was against a player named Kyle, and he actually jumped on a video with me to talk about our game and also to talk about his first win against a titled player, which occurred in this tournament. So check out the description. I'll add some links down below if you want to check those out. So my opponent started with e4, and I played the Caro-Kann, which is pretty typical for me. We went into an exchange and then the pan-off attack, which is always an interesting opening for the Caro-Kann. The idea that I like to go for in the pan-off attack, and I might not have really quite done it right, but it tends to be an idea that makes for some interesting positions, is I get my knights out, and then I actually fianchetto this dark squared bishop, get castled, and then I like to put my bishop on e6, which looks like a pretty weird place for the bishop. But the thing that I'm doing is I'm actually threatening to win this pawn. And if white takes my pawn, which they did, I feel like this is a favorable isolated queen's pawn position for me, or IQP position for me, because white has an isolated queen's pawn, but I'm very easily, like, I already have a knight in the way of that pawn, and it's going to be really hard for white to do what they want to do, which is to start to push that pawn and get it traded off. Now, I always have to watch out for sort of activity that white can start to push forward with. But I feel like, you know, my dark squared bishop is fianchettoed and pretty opened up and causing a lot of pressure already. I can potentially grab the open C file, and I think things are looking pretty good for black in this position. Okay, so bishop e3, queen b6, just kind of looking at the queen side here, attacking this pawn. And then after queen b3, I decided I could win a pawn at this point. And it's one of those things where it felt like maybe I was getting a little bit greedy, but I went for it. So I played, well, I captured the queen first, which sometimes you don't want to do in these sorts of positions because it opens up the rook on the A file. But in this case, now white also has doubled isolated pawns on the B file here. And it just seems like, you know, a really bad pawn structure. And then I'm able to, I sort of make the concession that I remove their isolated pawn weakness here, but I get to grab this pawn on b3. Now, I didn't see until a bit too late, maybe it was even like in this position, I don't quite remember, this was a while ago, I might have seen it back here and decided to go for it anyway, but I didn't see at some point that rook a3 was actually a really strong move. And it actually looks like my bishop is trapped now because, you know, I obviously can't move here, 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 or here. I can't move here because of the bishop. I can't move here because of the knight. And then I guess when I took the pawn, I always figured, you know, I can always just come back to e6, right? But then what happens is this pawn gets pushed and my bishop and knight are forked. And so I did calculate here a little bit, you know, too late. I should have tried to see this earlier, but I did calculate here that moving back to e6 was okay, but it did cause some problems. So white went ahead and pushed, and I calculated I can actually grab the knight here first. And then if white grabs the bishop, then I can now just grab that pawn. So this is okay. And then, you know, if white captures there, then I can just get my bishop out of the way. And so I actually don't lose material, but this was a little bit tricky. And in this position, I had to decide where to put my bishop. And bringing the bishop all the way back to g7 looks, you know, pretty natural. And technically, I could also have taken that pawn. But the thing I was worried about is if I capture here at some point, or if white captures here, now this F file is opened up. And there's also another issue. So I'll just keep going a little bit. I put the bishop here on f6 because now the bishop and the pawn are sort of anchoring themselves in and keeping this F file a bit more closed. The other thing that I was concerned about, so let's say I had put the bishop back here. Now, if the white pawn captures here, something I need to be careful of is if I take with the rook, which looks natural, now this runs into a pin, right? So I can't do that. I would have to take with the king. And now it just feels like I don't see a knockout punch, but it's just, I don't like how this discovered check can happen and the knight can go somewhere maybe useful after that. And so, yeah, it feels like just putting the bishop on f6 is better because it keeps this closed. And then what happened is white captured here and I took with the king because, again, if I take with the rook, that runs into this. So I take with the king. And now white kind of starts swarming my king a little bit. So the knight comes in with check. And again, I have to be careful. I can't put the king here because that runs into a fork of my king and rook. So I need to put the king here, which allows for this check. And then the king finally goes all the way into the corner. And I'm still safe, but I'm not feeling really great at this point. The knight comes in. I can't really move it because I only have a dark squared bishop and there's no pawns that can kick it. So that's actually a really nice spot for the knight. I move my rook over here. Of course, I can't move the rook to e8 because that runs into a fork as well. All kinds of tactics flying around. So I put the rook there, which doesn't feel great because it means that this rook is kind of stuck, right? So I was not feeling great in this position, but I am a pawn up. And I also have some pressure on this pawn, which I did end up winning. I'm not sure if my opponent kind of missed that or decided they weren't able to defend it in a way that they were happy with. I mean, it feels like they could have just put the rook here, maybe. I suppose that runs into knight a5, perhaps. It just feels like, you know, it defends and then it also attacks that, but my knight could probably... Yeah, I guess it ends up forking that bishop as well. So it's a pretty tricky position. But according to the engine, the eval is actually -1 here. So that makes sense because, as I said, I'm up a pawn. But you know, with all of the activity against my king, it feels like I'm not in as good of a position as I think I am. In any case, white pushed g4 to try to kind of come down and open up the king a little bit to keep the attack going. I played rook a b8, and what I was going for here is I want to win this pawn, as I mentioned. But back in this position, if I capture here, then rook b3 attacks the bishop and wins that pawn, and so I don't actually win anything. So moving the rook over actually threatens to win this. g5, and I capture. And now rook a2 is a move that I didn't really consider, but it's a good move because now... Again, it has a tempo on the bishop, and white is going to bring the rook to f2 in order to double up the rooks and put more pressure down this f-file on my king. And now I can't even bring my bishop back to f6, right, because of this g-pawn. So I bring the bishop to c3, and the rook goes over to f2 as anticipated. So this is a really interesting position. What's going on here? So I'm actually up 2 pawns, right? And we have opposite colored bishops on the board. So if a lot of things get traded off, but the bishops stay on the board, then it's possible that this is a draw because of the opposite colored bishops. Now, I do have 2 pawns on the outside here, which may be difficult for white to defend against. And as I mentioned, like, it depends a lot on how the trades happen. But the other thing that's going on is there's a lot of pressure against my king. My king is feeling quite sort of hemmed in the corner, and it seems like there's some way probably that white can make this attack work, right? So this is the position where I really couldn't figure out how to proceed correctly. I put the knight here, just kind of a cheap attack on the bishop, and thinking that maybe I could go up here and kind of put some pressure on that rook. But, you know, white moved the bishop out of the way quite easily, obviously. And then I just moved back. And to be honest, I don't really remember why I did that. I think, I'm not sure. Maybe I was thinking that this pawn was going to be under attack somehow. Maybe the knight could go up here and kind of attack that pawn and something was going to be a problem there. I'm not sure. But the problem is bringing the knight back actually kind of enabled white's attack because now this rook could come right down to f7. And I think in this position, I actually didn't see that. I just didn't see that the knight was defending this important f7 square, and I didn't see the way forward. Like, I didn't like this move for some reason, and maybe it was because I thought that this rook could just simply, you know, move somewhere more useful. But in any case, I moved the knight back, and this is where things kind of started to fall apart. So the rook came down here. And now the knight here is defending this pawn, so I'm okay, but, you know, white could always trade that off and win this pawn, right? So what I did is I moved the bishop here to also defend this pawn. And I was thinking, at some point, if this knight ever moves, I might want to wrap the bishop around and grab that pawn. I think what I really wanted to do was move the bishop back here and wrap around and aim for that pawn because it seems quite weak. But felt like, okay, I have to make a concession. I have to defend this pawn in case they trade off the knight. But then white found this beautiful move, knight f8. And knight f8 is just gorgeous because it's threatening checkmate with the rook over here on h7. And there's not much I can do about it. Even if I move the king over to g8, then this is actually still checkmate because it comes with a check from the bishop. And so I figured my only chance was to capture the knight. And then after these trades happen, I can escape here. And this is what happened, but this does not escape because rook g8 is simply checkmate because of this pawn blocking my king's escape and, of course, this bishop coming in as well. And so this is how the game ended, but let's go back to this position and look at what was the right plan. So the things that were going through my head here is I'm up material, I'm up 2 pawns, and so if I can just kind of trade things down and try to fend off this attack on my king, probably there's a chance that I can win. If anything, it should be a draw, right? Because, again, of the opposite colored bishops. And so the correct move, and actually the only move that really works in this position, is kind of a weird one. It's actually b5. And the reason that this works is because rather than trying to defend against this attack, the correct plan is actually counterplay. I have protected passed pawns on the outside of the board, the opposite side from where this attack is happening. And if I can start to get these pawns, rolling down the board, then it's going to distract white from this attack, right? Because they can't continue with this attack if I'm just going to, unless the attack is fast enough, of course. But if I'm threatening to just get some pawns down, to their side of the board and promote, then they're in a lot of trouble at this point. And so this is kind of the lesson that I'm taking away from this game. Like, I was so focused on the material imbalance and I was so focused on the king safety, rightly so, because those are both very important things, but I completely neglected to look at my opportunities for counterplay. And b5 would be like, I don't want to say a winning move for black, but it maintains the winning position for black. And if I had found that, recognizing that my knight is doing an important job defending this f7 square, nothing can actually easily kick the knight from that position, then, getting these pawns rolling down the board and causing those sorts of complications for my opponent was the right thing to do in this position. So as I mentioned earlier, figuring out the right plan can be really tough. There's a lot going on in a game of chess. And in this case, there was the material, there was the king safety, there was this big attack that I was, thinking a lot about. And so kind of taking a minute, I guess, to sort of survey the board, think about your options, recognize what sort of assets you have in the position. Like for me, these 2 outside passed pawns, protected outside passed pawns, were actually really important. And so using them to kind of cause complications and counterplay was a plan that I just completely missed because I was so focused on the other things that were going on. And so I think that's a pretty good lesson. Just kind of, sometimes you have to, calculate deeply and take one idea and really focus in really hard on that one idea. But sometimes you have to think a little more broad and shallow in a way. Like, think about what all of your options are and don't necessarily, calculate too deeply at first down any one particular sort of option or line or variation, but think about what all of your options are, get them all in your head, and then decide which ones are the ones that are worth a bit more attention. So anyway, I thought this was a pretty interesting lesson to learn. I hope that it was helpful for you and that it might be helpful for you if you're in a similar kind of situation in a game in the future. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.